Hello, welcome everyone. Good morning.
Hello.
Welcome everyone on Zoom. I can't see you yet, but I think I will later on. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce my old friend and guru, Naila Kabeer. Naila is going to talk about her book that's about to come out, and it's a real treat, the bits of it that I've read, because it covers a lot of ground and speaks to a lot of the issues that are close to our heart. Those of us who work in Bangladesh, but also in development and population change in Bangladesh. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to Naila. She's a professor of gender and international development in the Department of International Development and on the faculty of the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. She has over 40 years of experience in research. I'm close, but not quite there. Teaching, training, and doing policy advice, specializing in fields of labor markets and livelihoods, social protection, and collective action. Her main work has been carried out in South and Southeast Asia. She's a member of the International Association of Feminist Economists, a very exciting group that you all have seen or heard about. The Development Studies Association of the UK. She's on the board of UNRIST and UNU. And her latest book, which is about to come out, on renegotiating patriarchy. Will come out when, Naila?
Sometime later this year.
Okay. So I think the way we're going to do this is we're going to have Naila speak for about 35, 40 minutes. She promises not to use any slides, so we haven't made the arrangement. I hope that works for everyone. And then we'll have a Q&A. In the announcement, we mentioned that Mushtaq Chaudhry would be joining us, but unfortunately, like with almost everyone else I know, he's had a bout of the flu and has lost his voice. So he regrets. Instead, we are very pleased that David Lewis, another professor at the London School, will be joining online, and he was actually one of the reviewers of the so he knows the book much better than any of us here in person. So over to you, Naila. I said I would say that for people in the audience from Bangladesh, Naila is from Bangladesh, from the district of Faridpur, which is, I shouldn't say that.
The birthplace of
Right. So over to you, Naila.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Sajeda, Judith, and others in the Population Council for giving me this opportunity to talk about the book. And as anyone who has written a book will know, it is a very momentous moment when the book is finally almost out. And it's been preoccupying you for the last, for me, 2-3 years. And I often say, I started the book at the start of a sabbatical that I was given by my departments at LSE, but it coincided with the beginning of lockdown. And, those 2 years we were all locked down. A lot of people wrote memoirs of various kinds about themselves, about their families, about people they admired. And I look at this book as a sort of a memoir. So it's a memoir of a country, because it really, the starting point of what we call the Bangladesh paradox begins with people looking at the country in 1971 when it was born. And I trace that history to, let us say, 2010, 2015. And of course, although I left Bangladesh before 1971, I have what I call a living relationship with it. I go back almost every year. I have family, friends, I rent a flat. So I've tried to maintain that connection of having, for a lot of us in the diaspora, but of having two homes, two places that you can call home. Let me just go to the book, and I'm going to be in the interest of a fireside chat. I'm going to try and tell you a story. But it won't be the entire story of the book, which is 10 chapters. And at the moment, I'm afraid 125,000 words. I can't cut anymore. I simply cannot cut anymore because I would lose a lot. So what is the story that I'm trying to tell? And I'll skip chapters and I'll try and focus on what I think would be interesting to an audience that is linked with Population Council, which is to some extent the demographic aspect of the story. So when I began my career, it was, to do field work in a village in Bangladesh, in Faridpur district. And it was at a time when fertility rates were extremely high. And when people talked about Bangladesh, Malthus and Malthusian scenarios were never far away from the conversation. What are we going to do with this country that is reproducing at a rate that there's no carrying capacity? The density of population is amongst the highest in the world, bar city-states. It was also, of course, extremely poor. And as people will know, it was described as an international basket case by associates of Henry Kissinger. It was described as having one of the most oppressive, extreme forms of patriarchy in the world. So that is when I did my field work in a village in Bangladesh, and I reproduced what other people had found. There seemed no prospect that fertility rates would come down. And the literature that I read at the time explained why. It explained that labor was the main asset for people with otherwise very little land, or even if they had land, they needed children. Old age pensions, there were no old age security. So you had to have children in order to have some security in old age, but you had to have sons. So we'll get to the son preference in a minute. But also it was a violent society. Rivers moved their courses very often, and to defend whatever land you could find, you had to have what we called Shoktishali, muscle power. You had to have sons. So like the rest of the northern belt of India, Bangladesh was a society of strong son preference. And people, and during my fieldwork, I used an index developed by Coombs and Coombs, which allowed you to separate number preference from sex preference. Is it you're having a lot of children because you want large families, or are you having a lot of children because you want to make sure you have a minimum number of sons? So in my particular village, it seemed that son preference was the dominant motivation, why you wanted so many children. So I went away from my PhD saying, yes, people are right. It's not just the culture of the Delta, of Bangladesh is a Delta country. It's not just the pro-natalist culture of the Delta. There is an economic rationale whereby families with large numbers of sons prospered or did not experience downward mobility far more than small families. And small families were pitied because, you just didn't have enough sons. So fine, that was my PhD. I came away. I finished off at the LSE. I joined the International Development Studies Institute, the Institute of International Development at Sussex. But I kept an eye, obviously, on what was happening in Bangladesh. I continued to do research in Bangladesh. And so I became aware of the first set of articles, amongst them one of the ones that Sajeda co-authored with John Cleland, but a number of others, that started using the word paradox. I think Shopin Adnan, an anthropologist in Bangladesh, also started to the word paradox, conundrum, surprise, puzzle, miracle. These kinds of words started to pepper the conversations and the writings about Bangladesh. And what were they talking about? Well, for me, what they were talking about is the paradox they were talking about is the fact that Bangladesh, which still was one of the poorest countries in the world, in 71, only Rwanda or Ethiopia, depending on what you read, were poorer. So Bangladesh was one of the poorest countries in the world. Bangladesh had this extreme forms of patriarchy, and yet it seemed that Bangladesh fertility was beginning to make a very rapid decline. And so one of the first articles to comment on this came from Sajeda, John Cleland, and others, saying this is astonishing, because all the conditions you expect for demographic transition are not in place in Bangladesh. It is poor, it is uneducated, it is all of these things. elements were that child survival started to improve and education started to go up. And all of these indicators of social progress were outstripping wealthier neighbors like India, Pakistan, and many other countries in the world. So something was going on in Bangladesh that allowed it to defy the models of development that we work with. Economic growth? Nope, no economic growth. Modernization theory, still traditional attitudes, very superstitious. Demographic transition theory, mortality rates still very high. But there was one other paradox I'm interested in, but I won't talk about, is that what we saw was not improvements on social indicators, but a closing of the gender gap in these indicators. And that, of course, as a feminist economist, drew my attention. What was going on in this extremely patriarchal society that was leading to a closing of the gender gap in survival chances of children, infants and children, closing of the gender gap in education, and closing of, what was also happening is that girls were now outliving boys, unlike the past. So by, UNICEF cited figures that girls were now 20% more likely to survive than boys, and that is the norm around the world. And there was one other thing that drew my attention, and that is, as fertility declines, right, in India, people were reconciling the desire for small families with female selective abortion. So they wanted smaller families, but they wanted to make sure they had sons. And as a result, the sex ratio at birth, which the normal around the world is 105 boys to 100 girls. In India, the sex ratio at birth was rising from 105 to 110, and looking at northern India to 120. It looked like China and other parts of East Asia. In Bangladesh, extraordinarily, the sex ratio at birth at the start of this period, let us say 71 and earlier, was 105 boys to 100 girls, and it remained boringly the same. It did not change. So there is some variation in Bangladesh. People haven't been able to explain it. But at the national level, we were finding that families were reducing the numbers of children without manipulating sex ratios at birth. Given that I had looked at son preference in my PhD, I decided to go back to that same village and start asking questions. And using the same indicator that I had used in 79 when I did my PhD research, I found that definitely fertility rates had gone down in this village, as in the rest of Bangladesh. Definitely son preference had gone down. In fact, it had gone down so much that it was not very credible, right? The parents that we surveyed in this particular village, 600 women, but in the larger survey, 4,000 or 5,000 women. They were expressing a preference for daughters which seemed out of sync with what we knew about the rest of the country. So we then, in a second round of the survey, we surveyed 4,000 of the same women, and we asked a different question. This time we asked, given the number of children you have, the number of sons and daughters you have, do you want any more children? And what we found is that even it was more likely that those who had only daughters would want another child, presumably wanting a son. But the difference between those who had only daughters or who had only sons or wanting another child was no longer as striking as it had been in the past. And there were parents who were quite happy with having only daughters, because having one more child meant they would not be able to afford to look after their children. So parents were now saying, yes, there is some son preference, but really it's better to bring up children properly. So I talk a lot about the quantity to quality transition, that over time, parents had begun to understand the value of investing in their children. So what I want to do is go back to some of the explanations I looked for, right, in this paradox. Amazing progress on the social front, amazing progress on the gender equality front, even from a time when Bangladesh was poor and patriarchy was strong, and governance has always been very weak in Bangladesh. Let me just start with the fertility story. The people who said that fertility would not come down took what I would call, they were either statisticians asking questions through surveys, or they were taking what you would call an ethic perspective, right? They didn't ask people questions. They inferred from structures that it was likely that fertility would not come down. So they inferred from the structures that women had a stake in high fertility and large number of sons, because without sons, they had no status in society. So a lot of it was inference. It's when you looked at the people who took a much more ethic perspective, who asked people and asked women what they felt about high fertility, you got a very different story. So one of this was from James Boyce and Betsy Hartman, who went and did their fieldwork in Bangladesh in the mid-70s. And the stories they got were of women who were exhausted with childbearing. You know, they were exhausted, their hair was falling out, the infants were not being properly looked after because another baby was on the way. They had heard about family planning, but they didn't know what it meant. They'd heard about a miracle pill, didn't know what it meant. Another interesting study was done by Clarence Maloney and Azizur Rahman, and they combined quantitative and qualitative work, okay? And they found contradictions. So 90% of people would say something like, yes, it all depends on God. We have no control over how many children we have. But then they'd be asked, do you want any more children? And 90% would say, we want no more children. So what Maloney and Rahman said is that they're talking about the difference between the possible and the desirable. They did not see the possibility of controlling the number of births they had, but they desired fewer births. And so, and also you found gender differences. So women might want fewer children, but women seem to want more sons than men. So there was a kind of gender differential. And then, of course, we found, and I think people involved in that program, is Bangladesh pioneered a family planning, an approach to family planning that sought to address the constraints that women face in accessing family planning, which is rather than requiring women to go from their household to the clinic, they brought the clinic to the doorstep. And if that was a hunch that women would be more open to adopting family planning than men. Because if it had been left to men, you know, they could have easily gone to the clinic. So there was a hunch along in there somewhere. And what I also found interesting is that, of course, the family planning workers were trained in ways that were receptive to local culture. So they knew what women feared. They knew that they feared negative side effects. And they told them what negative side effects of family planning were and why it might happen. They knew what they feared about having too few children. And they pointed out to how infant mortality rates were going down with fewer children. So they could provide women with arguments that rested their fears, but they could also provide them with arguments that allowed them to stand up to in-laws and husbands who were not in favor. So one thing that the family planning workers did was they became a wedge of change at the household level. The other thing I think that happened is that there was a very interesting distinction between how people, the government and women themselves, what hierarchy of methods they wanted, right? So for women themselves, they wanted methods that could be concealed or that could be explained away. Now, the pill is something familiar. It could be explained away. Depo-Provera, sterilization are things that could be hidden if you did it quietly. So for a lot of women, the hierarchy of family planning methods reflected their concealability in cases where there was opposition. For the government, of course, it was what you could not reverse. So they favored sterilization, okay? They favored abortion, etc. They favored the pill far less because you could forget. So there was an interesting, ways in which people, what they valued. And when I was doing my field work in Bangladesh, and this is something I told Sajeda, a lot of women would come up to me in 79 saying in whispers, Appa, are you from the family planning? And what they wanted was Deva Pavera because it could be concealed. So for these women, they knew they had opposition from their families. They wanted methods that could be hidden. So part of the story of fertility decline in Bangladesh is a hidden one. And you got groups of women going without permission for sterilization. And then, but also fearing going for sterilization because husbands would threaten not to pay for any negative side effects. So to me, what we haven't got from the story of family planning at the macro level is the contestations, the conflicts, the negotiations that went on by people who were determined to have fewer children. So that was the story of family planning. But along with the publicity that went out, and I don't know who decided it, the publicity that went out contained often within it a story about gender equality. So the happy family was one boy and one girl. Okay. If you want to make sure that your daughter doesn't have children too early, make sure she gets to school. If she marries too early, she's going to be ill and, they're going to be quarreling all the time, etc. So very interestingly, with BRAC, with the government, the messages that went out contained within them a story about gender equality. And actually what we then started to see is parents themselves deciding that the future, given that land was at a premium, people didn't have land, that what they could leave their children was education. And education would give them access to better jobs. And so education became like a bequest that you passed on to your children. But also what was interesting was that girls' education was rising. And here I just want to unpack a couple of the findings on girls' education. So apparently President Zia, when he was president in 1984, experimented with a stipend for girls to go to school. And he had read the international literature about girls' education and the kind of catalytic effect it could have on, demographic outcomes. That was then picked up when Begum Zia became prime minister in the early 1990s, funded and so on. And so we got the girls' secondary school stipend. We also had a cash for education. First it was food for education, then it was cash for education. Interestingly, the cash for education program favored boys' education. I mean, girls went to school, but boys in much larger numbers. It was the secondary school stipend program that made sure that resulted in many more girls going to school. And here's something that I haven't put in the book, but I've been thinking about. The food for education program went to the household. It was not earmarked for anyone, right? It went to the household. The secondary school stipend program went to the household, but it was earmarked for girls. The only time that girls benefited from the food for education program was in female-headed households, okay? But in the secondary school stipend, girls benefited in large numbers, and there's no doubt about that. But something else also interesting that has come out is that the school stipend only pays for the fees. Parents are required to put in additional money out of their pockets for school materials, all the additional stuff that improves the quality of education. They spent much more of that money on boys. So boys do better in school, they're less likely to drop out. Only in female-headed households did the food for education program have a positive effect on girls. So my question is, who controls the money, right? The food for education went to the household in general. It was spent perhaps by whoever was in charge, more likely to be men, more likely to be spent on sons. The secondary school stipend was earmarked for girls, so you didn't have to have an argument. But in female-headed households, the food for education program went to the female head of households. So one of the things that it's coming out of this research, and I've followed it through to the end, And now I found there is a quantitative survey, or maybe DHS data or whatever, by Heath and somebody, that shows that in Bangladesh, mothers of daughters are much more likely to go out to work and are much more likely to use their income on their daughters. So one way that mothers of daughters make sure that their daughters get a chance in life is by going out to work. And we find that they use their income much more to promote the education and life chances of their daughters. So how much time have I got, Sajeda? Okay, because I want to talk about the sex preference stuff. Okay, so girls are going to school. Girls outnumber boys at primary and secondary level, but they drop out in larger numbers at secondary level, and they're less likely to go on to tertiary education. Employment chances have expanded in Bangladesh, but in family planning and education, they had the support of the state, right, for family planning. When women want to go and take up microfinance or go into the garment industry, there's no support from the state. The state did not expect women to go in such large numbers into the garment sector, right? It was almost an accident. They thought that would be men. So women's entry into the labor market has been done on their own steam, right? It hasn't received the same support from the state that family planning, education, etc. It has received in microfinance support from NGOs, right? But the NGOs also started with men until they found out that men were not paying off their debts in the same way as women. So nevertheless, we have seen women going in large numbers. We have seen female labor force participation in Bangladesh steadily rising from like supposedly 3% in the 1970s to 32 or 36% now. But much of it is in home-based self-employment. It's money earning, income earning, but it's home-based. I think only 10 or 12% of it is in wage labor and in the garment sector and so on. But what all of this means is that daughters are no longer the liability that they were when I was doing my PhD. When all they did was eat. They might do unpaid household labor, but let's face it, nobody values unpaid household labor. They value money. And today, daughters, whether they're doing microfinance-based enterprise or they're working in government community service, they are earning. So I went back to this village that I did my PhD to find out how they explained what is now being shown up in the survey data, that people want smaller families. There is still some evidence of son preference, but people are with zero sons still will say they don't want any more children. Son preference has not disappeared, but there is a much stronger preference for balanced sex composition. And in the surveys that in going back to this village, there is a perfect, parents are perfectly happy to have only daughters. If I have only one child, and if it's a daughter, I will do my best for her. I'm not going to have another child and that will endanger my ability to look after children. So we went back and I interviewed the older generation and the younger generation. The older generation talked about the village that I remembered. Very little electricity. Men worked mainly in the agricultural sector. Women did paid domestic work, very limited. And then you talk to them about today, the older women about today and the younger parents, men, fathers and mothers about today. And they talk about the change. And they are very clear. Because remember, the 70s, we had a famine. People were like skeletons. So they see today as much better, great improvement. And they also see that girls have become smarter. And they attribute that smartness to government programs, to NGOs, to radios, etc. But they are aware that, and here is the thing that I found most fascinating. Mothers, we talk about the history of a country shaping its present, right? And providing pathways. There's a path of dependence to the future. Countries don't grow randomly. The structures of the past shape the parameters of the present. But what comes out in this book And, I've read work by Sajeda, all sorts of people who've been writing over the years. What comes out is how much personal history matters. Mothers who grew up knowing that they were discriminated against, that their brothers got the first shot at everything, that their education was compromised so that their brothers could go to school. Wives who grew up knowing what it was to be at the beck and call of a mother-in-law, who often treated, whose only control in life was over their daughters-in-law. And they give you, if you were lucky, you had a kind mother-in-law. Most of them had mothers-in-law who wanted to make sure that they knew where the power was, who did all the domestic work, etc., etc. So this personal history, and it shaped how mothers looked at daughters, right? It shaped it. They did not want their daughters to have the same lives. But now they also had the means by which they could ensure that their daughters had better lives. Mothers did have access to money. Mothers did have access to microfinance, to the law. The law was changing. NGOs were talking in a certain way. There's a whole other chapter about the rise of Islamic orthodoxy, which I won't go into here. But fathers were also changing. And this one woman said, we couldn't have done all this if it hadn't been for fathers as well. So fathers were changing. But what was it that, suddenly both mothers and fathers were saying that girls are more compassionate, neither Maya, I'd say. That fathers will say girls have a special place in their heart for their fathers. Mothers would say, daughters-in-law won't listen to me, but my daughter will listen to me. But of course, daughters have always been loving. They've always been compassionate. What's so new? What is new is sons. That as Bangladesh diversifies, as migration becomes the way forward, as the women that the sons marry are also educated and have a voice and want the sons to focus on their families, not on their in-laws, more and more parents seem to be turning to the daughter. However far, and they're trying to marry their daughters off closer to the village. They're educating their daughters so their daughters can stand up to the in-laws. And this is what is extraordinary. They're educating their daughters so that the daughters can walk out of a marriage if the marriage proves to be abusive. You would not have heard that in 1979. No way. The last thing you wanted was your daughter to walk out of a marriage and come back to you. So what is changing in Bangladesh is companionate marriages are rising. Daughters-in-law are becoming much more assertive. And I have some amazing quotes. I've put together the quotes that mothers-in-law are saying about their daughters-in-law. They come into the household as though they own the household. It is old people who are suffering. And so more and more they're looking to their daughters. Now, one thing that Sajeda asked is, and it's not there in the book yet, I hope I can put it in, is what evidence do we have that daughters are indeed fulfilling this function? What evidence do we have that son preference is declining, not disappearing, but declining, because daughters are now fulfilling them? But the word, daughters are becoming like sons, date back to Shirley Lindenbaum in the early 1980s. Right through, when you wanted to praise your daughter, you say she's becoming like a son. Garment workers, young garment workers, single women, who were working so that their parents didn't have to work as hard, would say, my father should never regret that he never had a son. So the highest praise you can give to a daughter is to say she's become like a son. So what evidence do we have? Well, because I was talking to parents rather than to daughters, married daughters, I was talking to parents, they were talking about what they observed around them. So-and-so's daughter got a job and is now looking to build a house, etc. But when I did work with the garment workers in 1987, a lot of single women, and they would say things like, my mother suffered for me. I want to make sure that she does not suffer. I will only marry a man who will allow me to continue to support my mother. So you got this kind of evidence that daughters were in turn looking to supporting their parents. So I want to conclude by asking, what did I conclude from this? As I said, daughters haven't suddenly become compassionate. They haven't suddenly become loving. What they are seeing is that fathers and mothers are making much more efforts on their behalf. I think what's happening is that patriarchy has not disappeared, right? So sons, they can marry who they want. They don't need approval of their parents who they marry. In fact, it's up to the parents to accept. A daughter to marry against her parents' wishes means she cuts off one of her sole sources of support. A daughter still cannot get equal opportunity at jobs, right? So what is happening is, while patriarchy is being renegotiated in Bangladesh, while there's a new intergenerational bargain being struck, whereby parents invest in daughters as much as in sons, in the hope that daughters will one day look after them in their old age, daughters still have an interest and a stake in keeping their access back to their parents alive. Daughters still cannot rely on their husbands to be, the rock of their old age. So men still have much greater freedom. They may have many more economic opportunities. But for daughters, there is still, they will not cut loose. They will not go adrift. They will still rely on their parents. In the past, daughters would waive their rights to land, if they had land, for their brothers, so that they had a way back home. Now daughters will invest in their parents so that they continue to have a way back home if they're ever cast out of the marital home. So I'll end there.
So I'm not sure how we're supposed to do this transition. So I and Corinne help out. Should we go sit there? After I introduce David and let him speak, and then we'll go to questions. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. That was a lovely, succinct presentation of Naila's wonderful ideas. And I'm sure it'll generate tons of conversation. I want to invite David, who as I said before, is a professor of anthropology and development at LSE. He's worked on a range of issues related to Bangladesh. Like Naila and myself, he's frequently seen in Bangladesh. He spends a lot of time there. And more importantly, most of his research is on Bangladesh. His book, Bangladesh Politics, Economy, and Civil Society, was published in 2011. And since then, he's written quite a bit, including co-editing books about kind of interventions and how innovations translate into engagement. So, David, thank you so much for stepping in, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Sajeda and Naila, for inviting me to your fireside chat. I'm still looking for the flyer, but maybe we don't need it. But anyway, Naila, congratulations on the book. It's such an important contribution on a range of levels. I'm going to say a few words about what I think those issues are and that contribution. Then I've got a couple of questions as well. So I think the importance of trying to explain this shift in patriarchal structures is what motivates the book, and this extraordinary phenomenon of the disappearance of earlier forms of gender discrimination that had characterized Bangladesh in the 70s, and also the fact that they are, to all intents and purposes, persisting in other parts of South Asia, which I think makes the book incredibly important. It also shows how this reevaluation that you've talked about of the value of daughters has incredibly complex, sort of multi-causal explanations. And I think your book shows really nicely that this needs to be understood through a systems type approach, a complex systems approach, rather than ideas about linear cause and effect. And I think the book talks in real sort of detail, fine-grained detail, about the trade-offs, the synergies, the feedback loops that help explain these changes. And I think what's also nice about the book is the fact that it links these micro-level changes to the wider context, changes in the external environment around state, civil society, market. And the book shows how these macro-level changes interact with the changing ideas around agency amongst women themselves, and this idea of the modifications to the habitus concept that you use, resulting in changes around the willingness to act against oppressive practices that had previously been seen as hard to change. And you talked, just now, I think, about this idea of the desirable turns into the possible. So I think the importance of placing this sociological and demographic data in the context of these wider institutional and historical changes, is a key contribution. I think also the book demonstrates the usefulness and value of interdisciplinarity. And, I don't think one could reach this level of explanation without being incredibly adventurous around that notion of interdisciplinarity. You also, I think, show us the value of a bottom-up approach. You talked just now about the uncovering of hidden stories. For example, the family planning example you gave. And so this idea that understanding how ordinary people respond to change and to policies and interventions through interpreting and acting on change. And then finally, I think what's important is the value of the long view, tracing the seeds of change going back decades that produce over time wider changes. And I think you point to some of these isolated examples of early unusual behavior in the past that helps to feed into wider changes today. And you show how in a way it's about the moving of the dial of possibilities as a way of explaining in a very sophisticated way how change happens. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I've got 2 or 3 general questions. I thought it'd be interesting for you to say a little bit more about what we learn about how to do interdisciplinary and mixed methods work from this research, because that's something that I think many of us are becoming more and more interested in. Second thing is, I think you talk about how there have been changes to patriarchy. Patriarchy has changed, but can we say that it's less oppressive? Has its character changed? Or is this really just a story of how women are becoming more adept at negotiating it? That's one of the questions that I had. Finally, I guess maybe you could say a little bit more about how this kind of reconfiguring of the intergenerational bargain that you talked about. You talk about women in these stories and these quotes sort of are revealing that behaviors are being based less on tradition and more on transactional elements. And I wonder if if you want to comment a little bit more on whether that's a sustainable distinction. Is life becoming more individualized? Can we make a distinction between tradition and transactional behaviors, or are these just about levels of individualization? I've got a few more questions, but I think I should stop there because I'm sure there's lots more questions coming in from the audience already. So let me leave it there. But thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to comment on the book.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. It's nice to hear from someone who's read the whole book, and I know it is very encouraging. I'd like to respond to some of the questions you raised. I think that are interesting. I'm going to leave the first one to the end. How does one go about doing interdisciplinarity? That's a major methodological challenge. The structure of patriarchy has changed. I think it has changed. I think Bangladesh has been, I kind of identify two forces that have driven change at the societal level and at the level of gender in Bangladesh. One is poverty. Poverty, the kind of poverty that we had, is a very powerful force for people to reconsider their options. Okay, what served them well in the past is not serving them as well in the present. They have no land to leave. There's no guaranteed patronage. They have to fend. And this idea of fending for oneself is again a theme that comes up again and again. And I compared two quotes. One from S.R. Osmani in the 1990s, where change still looked remote, hadn't become real. And he talks about the forces that had driven peasants that were so attached to their land to leave the land. That it was, it was a driver of survival and poverty. And that was in 1990. And then in 2006, Hussein Zillur Rahman also wrote about changing psyches. And he said that today, even poor people in Bangladesh feel they have a say in how change will happen. They have become protagonists in the way that they want. That individual change cannot happen unless there's something going on in structures. So I think, my reading of what has changed is that the forces that kept people who were at the bottom of the hierarchy dependent on those who were powerful, those forces have weakened because options have diversified. You do not have to rely on the landlord as your patron. You now can, opt for perhaps a lousy employer, but the options have diversified. You can go abroad in search of a job. You are hearing stories of how other countries live. So I feel like there has been an enormous change at both level of structure and at levels of subjectivity. So I feel that women, and I think the question about transactional, we become far more transactional. That's a somewhat negative way of putting it, but I think we have. The difference is there was always a transaction involved. When we talked about the patriarchal bargain, the transaction involved in the patriarchal bargain was embedded in ideas about what is proper, what is correct, what is right, what is appropriate. The new transaction is one that has to be achieved. You very clearly invest in daughters because you very clearly want something in return. So we've gone from the hidden, implicit transaction to something much more explicit. So I don't think that, yes, there is a change going on, I also hear a lot from both mothers, daughters, fathers about thinking for yourself. So you are moved from a society and a way of life where society taught for you. You complied with norms because you had no other. That was your guide to the right behavior. There's much more emphasis now on thinking for yourself. And the word, and someone actually suggested that I use this in the title of the book, standing on your own feet. The number of times that appears, she should be able to stand on her own feet. And by that, they also mean she should be able to think for herself. And in that, and I'm not saying that the village that I returned to is typical, but I don't know which village is typical. No village is typical. This is a relatively bedrock village. It's not far from the town. It had a very feminist organization in it for many years, my mother's organization. I didn't choose it because she was there. That's coincidence. However, maybe that's why they speak in these terms. But you see, that's why I cite other people who have also said these same things. I think Shelley Feldman and Peter McCarthy have talked over the years about standing on your own feet. And they say that the lessons, that if men learned the lesson of poverty, that you had to leave the land and you had to find, women learned the lesson of self-reliance. That the patriarchal bargain that they were relying on was no longer as reliable in far more areas. And they had to find different ways of reinforcing some kind of bargain. And some of the work that you're doing on garment workers, that I think you and Nazli Kibria. For garment workers, a lot of them, they wanted some degree of independence, but they didn't want to shake the family. They didn't want to rock that boat. But there were others who said, my parents didn't look after me, my parents didn't educate me, my husband treats me like whatever. Why should I put up with this? I think this business of walking out of your marriage and parents approving of it, anybody who was doing research in Bangladesh in 71 and in the 70s would have been shocked. That parents actually, a book has come out recently that talks about how much more acceptable divorce has become. Now, this is all people talking, we don't have a survey data that talks it one way or the other. And people still don't admit to it. But something in patriarchy has changed. So I think that I know. I'm just going to continue with David's question, but take up a couple of the other answers, other questions.
We take some questions from the audience and then okay. Just because I know Judith is itching. Wait. And then we'll go.
First of all, thank you. And I mean, the broad question of the bargain, patriarchal bargain, wasn't really about, if the exit costs were too high, wasn't protected, as you describe it. It's just you finally, there's mediation of the exit cost. Then you demonstrate that even Ruth Simmons was writing about the strategies used by finally the field of 11,000 family planning workers. She says, the woman does afraid of the IUD, and she says, your neighbor, she doesn't name them, have them, they didn't die. I mean, these, in effect, this is quintessential bargaining model stuff, intergenerational, intra-household allocation. It was a one-way contract. It was enforced by violence, oppression. I remember a paper long going far away of the mortality rate of widows who didn't have two sons. This was wasn't. The change is taking place in and among women. The broader question, it seems to me, in other words, and covert you mentioned early on, years ago I did a paper with John Bongard, said the question was, women were saying, well, we're not going to use family planning because our husbands object. Well, 2/3 have never asked them. That is the measure of powerlessness. You can't even bring the thing up, right? And so in any case, what Ruth was describing with the family planning workers you mentioned in the book talk about, were that they were, bringing female space. They were anticipating and letting women define the risks. And then they were, you're afraid of sterilization, let me go with you. You're afraid of the side effects, etc. There's something special about Bangladesh. And I think it may feed in. The large NGOs, which have become so extraordinary in the world, seem to me to have an intentional vision of social capital and market disruption. BRAC early on had contracts with the village, and the BRAC schools were 70% female, right? 30% male. The males that were there were the same age or younger than the females. So that's, I think, radical and an interesting choice. Amin had a model that was anyone could do it, but for the females was an opportunity because they were landless, but they had each other. And the female family planning workers that were so successful when they were finally fielded were successful because they didn't follow directions, that everything that was successful, the things that were neither paid for, trained for, or supervised for. There was something about, perhaps it arose out of the poverty and the conflict, but the models that were so transformative in the world relied upon creating female solidarity structures. So I think that was a great gift of Bangladesh. And did it precede? Was it a Bengali characteristic? You had a weak central government that probably helped. It didn't crack down on them. Where does that fit? I think it was an exemplar and a real gift to the world.
That's it. One of the things that the earliest chapter does, is actually talk about the history and geography of Bangladesh. Because I feel like a lot of the change that I go on to describe, and why that same change did not happen in neighboring India and Pakistan, is that Bangladesh was always very imperfectly integrated into the classic patriarchy of Northern India. It was Delta country, it was isolated from the mainstream of India, of the subcontinent, till the late 17th or whatever. And it was a land of peasants, and it had a succession of people trying to rule them, convert them. So it was exposed not only to its own folk religion, but it absorbed waves of often anti-Brahminical religions. So people talk about, no religion is pure. But they use the word syncretic about Islam in Bangladesh more than they use it about Islam in many other countries. Syncretic means an amalgam of different kinds of beliefs, which makes it more flexible, makes it more open to change. Yeah. Much more. But I think one of the things that I haven't been able to talk about is that at the same time, this is the other dimension of the paradox for me, the cultural dimension of the paradox. So the economic dimension is the fact that food is, poverty is high. Political dimension is that we have a very right. But the cultural dimension is that along with these very we have seen the rise of Islam. An important Islam, which is very different from the synthetic Islam. And there is a whole chapter in the book trying to explain why, despite the rise of Islamic orthodoxy, we have still managed to make it. So that collective that you're talking about, I don't think that's indigenous to us. I think that was made to happen. If anything, Bangladesh is described as a very individualistic society. Who was talking about Ghana? We were talking about Ghana. Exactly. In Ghana, the sense of community is very much stronger, and you can work with community. In Bangladesh, because of the shifting land and so on, as somebody said, you might pray in a mosque in one village, you might go to a money lender in another. So there is nothing, at least as far as the literature tells me, there's nothing inherently realistic about that. So the fact that these people managed to get together were really work. In fact, women were deliberately isolated. That's our problem. I think that was something that we pointed. Can I just go back to the research?
I wanted to, I suppose, add a little bit of complexity to that vis-a-vis rural and urban. This data is a little dated, it's from 2017, but you do see that garment workers are overwhelmingly young. They don't get promoted. Cutters and floor managers remain men. It's very, very hard for women to get into those levels. The young women who work in the garment factories do still turn over their money on Wednesdays to their fathers or husbands. Huge amounts of GDP. And it's hard to see a trajectory from a job to a career. Although the young women and all the studies we did at that time did indicate that they associated the job with independence, with agency. It was still just a step on a journey of empowerment. But did not get the sense that, and they did not feel that they had agency to make life choices. So this is in line with some experiences in factories in India as well, where it's not converting into other indicators of declining patriarchy. So, for example, if you look at West Bengal and UP, it's very it's not a consistent message, you know. Although West Bengal has always had less sex selection, has had higher rates of girls going to school, which are points you mentioned in Bangladesh. When it comes to GDP, when it comes to women's economic empowerment, you don't see it the same kind of shifts. Yet, I do think that there are some cultural factors there which are related to caste and clan, which I think is also what you were saying. Because you don't have caste in Bangladesh, it does lead to a little bit more freedom to negotiate power structures, which you don't get in UP at all. Because then in UP and Bihar, there's also clan which comes in, which makes it even more rigid. So my question is the future of Bangladesh, how do we prevent the future of the decline of patriarchy in Bangladesh from looking something like a Japan, Korea, where huge progress in these indicators of human development haven't led to gender equality. Or Philippines, which is more mixed, but then you have the religious elements too, as you do in Bangladesh. Or forget all of these. How is Bangladesh perhaps going to show how it can continue to be the paradox and do things differently, where these gains in the family, these negotiations in the family also succeed on the economic and socioeconomic levels?
You know, the story you're talking about, that one of the interesting things about writing is every single thing that has been directed toward women in Bangladesh has generated controversy, right? There has been black, white, and gray. So about family planning, you know, you have people saying this is a war on women's body, right? And others saying this is liberating women from this reproduction. If microfinance is leading to violence against women, you know, this is awful, then I think those. Or microfinance is leading to if the government industry is exploiting capital, etc. The story you're telling me, 2017, we heard that story. Or 1987 onward. So then it becomes, which set of stories, how does one make one's way through these very conflicting? And I think the answer is there's nothing that is no change in Bangladesh that takes on patriarchy will be without harm. My research with Bangladeshi garment workers then and now, these in 2017, you know, I've gone back to 1987, and I've also gone back to garment workers in 2017, 2018, including one of us, including all the stories. It does not, yes, they are people, you know, and even after the Accord Alliance treaties, you know, the level of abuse they get from the Catholic law, that's still there. That hasn't gone away. And you also start to understand where that abuse is coming from. The supervisors are abusing the workers, the managers are abusing the supervisors, and the buyers are abusing the managers. The prices they give to the employers have gone down and down as the delivery time has cut. So there is nothing in the government industry to hold it up as a beacon of liberation. It is, and that is what I've tried to do, is what are the workers saying? Now, some of the workers you talk to, they say, there's no hope. I hand my money to my husband. Other workers say, well, I hand my money to my husband, but he knows where that money is coming from. There has been a shift in how I am treated. So, I think there's one quote I quote from 87 of play, but she and her husband, the husband says, oh, she's earning money, I have to listen to what she says. And she says, if I weren't earning that money, I would be made to look after all these children. So it depends on. And that has been real challenge in this book. And I've tried to address some of these contradictions in footnotes, but there's a limit to how many footnotes you can put, right? So that's why I really like every now and again relying on statistical data. That recent study, right, I think it's going to be that recent study has provided national survey evidence from a hunch. And that is mothers wanted to make sure that they had the resources that their daughters would not repeat their life. And that survey is very like that. Mothers are supported who work and who study. There's no simple story coming up. You might read the same literature that I read, and you might come up with something different. But you will also have to look at story. And so I think that's where I go to this and try and see what people explain. And I talked about education, and I was talking to Judith about education earlier. What do you think about the simplicity of that recommendation? The statistical analysis that tells us the impact that they is for them, the difference that it makes. And why I really would like to kind of share with you is actually one of the few people back in the 80s that tried to understand what is it about education. So going back to your question, how do we prevent it from happening? How do we prevent? Is that an easy question? No. Right now, we are seeing a steady rise in an Islamic orthodoxy that is against almost all the gains that women are doing. The concession they make is yes, women can go out to work, but it has to be in gender-centered environment. As it happens, it is in gender. But I think the only positive thing we have going for us is that we have not taken well to it. And maybe we will continue to resist any kinds of it.
Naila, you want to take some of the Zoom questions?
I want to go back to David's one. No, I think the thing about interdisciplinarity and mixed method, I've become, in my own way, a very powerful, strong, loud advocate for interdisciplinarity. And everything in the university system, particularly in Britain now, where we have the research excellence framework, which has so far rewarded you from staying within your discipline. And yet I think each discipline has something interesting to offer on the same phenomenon. Bring a group of sociologists, political scientists, psychologists, etc., to look at the same phenomenon, and you will get a much richer understanding of parts of the world we know so little about. And we know so little about them because there's been too much reliance on these major surveys and so on, and not enough reliance on people's own subjectivities, interpretations, reactions. So interdisciplinarity and of course mixed methods. I think we were going towards, in development studies, towards a greater appreciation of mixed methods, but it's kind of been hijacked by the RCTs, by the dominance of RCTs, which don't combine, which don't take a mixed method. So I think there is developing within development studies a whole group of us that are saying, there are problems with our cities and problems with everything, but unless you supplement what you're doing through these experiments with context, with history, with meaning, what is the meaning of your findings? How did they happen? I think we are, going backwards. So I think, I know David agrees with me that how do we reform an educational system so that people may specialize in a discipline, but they are forced to learn from other disciplines. So, engineers to be forced to do sociology, right? Economists to be forced to look at sociology, and so you have options, and that's what options are for. So by all means, I think it's fine to specialize in a discipline and to learn from its traditions and theories, but it should be a part of your education system that you try and understand what you're learning from the perspective of the learner. I'll just go back to, there's one about from Jose Roberto Luna, coming back in the history of gender equality. I'm wondering whether you discuss the concept of empowerment agency in your book, as there are multiple understandings. Yes, the book is called Gender Agency and the Bangladesh Paradox, and I embed my understanding of agency very much in ideas of structure. And because agency, devoid of structure, is just like free floating in the group. And that's not how we make decisions, how we act. We act in the context of the society we live in and what is considered appropriate and what they are willing to provide. So I actually work with all the different forms of agency that have been demonstrated in this attempt to make change happen. Why do people comply with patriarchal norms which are so clearly against their interests? What makes them start to break away from patriarchal norms? What motivates them? What are the resources that they draw on to do so? So yes, Jose Roberto Luna, I spoke a lot about agency. Monica Dasgupta, can you help us to understand how the three prevalence of child marriage and violence against women coexists with this increased women education employment? I think early child marriage and violence against women, particularly public violence against women, I think a lot of, intimate partner violence and violence within the home, we have contributed. If you listen to the qualitative research, my research, and Ruth's research, Sid's research, they say intimate partner violence. They say that the way that men used to behave in the past is now considered no decent man would behave that way. Now, that's not picked up in the survey data. So, something has to be reconciled. What they will talk about is public harassment. And so we've seen, so early marriage is one way of, getting your daughter married before anything happens that might compromise their marriage. But also we've seen, and I think you've picked up on this, is girls may now continue to go to school or to educate after marriage, which was not the case in the past. In the past, married and then educated. So girls are getting married early, but their education is continuing. So in that sense. But it is true that, again, it's part of a paradox. Fertility has declined, everything seems to have gone in the right way, but age of marriage has remained quite stubbornly low. And that we find. So I think for me, I look towards public violence and the fact, and the other thing that has happened in the face of public violence is dating.
Yeah.
Right? Dating has become a way of allowing women to move around in the public domain. Of course, it's religious, of course, but in a country like Bangladesh, there is no one motivation. It's not just about showing your religious faith. There are other motivations. And one is, of course, fashion. Westernized fashion is about jeans, and for a lot of women, they wear fancy hotelas in Europe. And actually, there are 2 stores in Bangladesh, online presence. One is for religious hijabi women, and one is for westernized women. And I call the westernized one, I call it my family, because it's got long sweeping gowns. And the one for me, hijabi, I call it, feels of a really nice things. But again, you've got the sweeping, the only difference is the pattern. But there's kind of pattern also. And there is respectability. So one way that you deal, it doesn't matter, it doesn't really go there. But one way you deal with family is to travel. So child marriage, all of that, and I don't know about the violence, we need to be much more careful research into things we're talking about. There is a study again from Bangladesh, government workers reported lower levels of physical than other. So this issue of violence is a difficult one to tackle. But I think people have their own ways of Naila said that he agrees with my account, and still think religious belief, religious belief is still playing a role in general. As I said, I think religion has always been a factor that people are more comfortable with accepting religion. But I also, like, again, there's not enough room in the book to talk about it. What I noticed, going back to Maloney and the research from the 1970s, is there is a strand in this research that tells you, so we cannot talk about Islam anymore. We have to talk about what kind of a Muslim. Because some people don't pray at all, but they're Muslim. Right? Some people pray 5 times a day, go on night, and they're Muslim. So you're a Muslim. You have to differentiate within Islam what kind of a Muslim you are. So the word people used to use was religiosity, right? About how often we prayed and how many days we prayed. And I think follow a thread right through this research before the rise of the Wahhabi Islam. A thread that tells you the more religious your family was, the less likely you practiced any form of gender equality. So going back to Aziz, Maloney Aziz, picking up more recent studies about the madrasas. I think you've done one, and there's been others. Children who go to religious schools, madrasas, are much less likely to hold egalitarian attitudes on gender than children who go to secular schools. Girls who go to madrasa are much more likely to hold less egalitarian than girls. So religion is there, but it's not as yet. It does not dominate all the other things. The other thing I can leave out of the book is what the people in that village, how they explain change in their village. Right? But it's already too long. I think it's when government is identified as a major donor. Donors are not. Donors don't feature in their work. Governments, NGOs, the law. And what I did quote is one father saying, we do many things that are they're not Islamic, but they're good for them. They're kind of making a distinction between what they see as a very much more fundamentalist version of Islam, as I said, there's many different kinds of Islam, and what they see as good for social progress. This is desire, I don't know if it's found it, be modern. Yeah. We have desire to be modern. So the alternative to being Islamic is to be modern. And I know that a lot of people say that Islam is bringing new forms of modernity in, but that's not necessarily what people in this particular place do. But that desire to move with the time, that seems to be quite strong. I don't know.
Okay, thanks. I think you have a comment? Yeah. Or yes. and then I'll say a few things and we'll come back.
This is wonderful. What is happening is it inspires my own recollection of work we did in Bangladesh. For the Canadian High Commission, challenged with the task of understanding why men were not working in the health sector. Thousands of men were not working, and the government wanted the Canadian co-financier to finance their salary. And we wrote a memo for the Canadian mission and the bank and the government that had the title, A Job is a Threat to Family Income. And what we were able to show was that a man was no longer part of a patriarchal system of wealth. They had to do so many things that you could never understand what their occupation was. They were facilitators, doers, connectors. They had. So we couldn't design a study that would have a single variable for a man's income. Not only was society reduced, as you described it, but the economy was becoming reduced. Landholding is no longer a source of wealth. Land holding was so small and so minor to the survival of a family. They had to do many things to survive. And patriarchy was becoming obsolete in the economy of the 1980s. So having come to this kind of judgment, I'm wondering, what are we learning from Bangladesh that is relevant to development policy and gender development in Africa or other parts of the world? And what would be your comments about the extent to which things are so unique to Bangladesh that we can't really export the learning? Or are there things that we're learning that really have direct policy value in other regions?
You know, different regions has a uniqueness about it. I think there's a couple of things. One is, if we go back to the issue of demographics and law. I think one major lesson that comes out is people prevention, old age security. You know, what is changing families to move away from something is the idea of old age security. That's one lesson I think that comes out very strongly. But the other lesson that goes back to what you were saying about is that it needs this thing of replication, this thing of transferability, needs a lot of thought to work out, you have the kernel of an idea, but to embed that idea in a different social context, I think needs a lot of the kind of experimentation that was done in Bangladesh to make Amin work. And my great hostility to RCTs is that we do a small scale study here, and then it worked, and then we I go back again to something that we talked about, and that is, if there is one single force for change around patriarchy, it is the associational power of women. So how does one build various forms of creativity? It's, it can be self-help groups, it can be cooperatives, like they are. That, I think, is a lesson that challenge is working out what form that association is. So, I think when we looked at Ghana, we looked at Ghana, and the church seemed to be quite an important role, playing quite an important role in building groups. Now, one would want to know is, can one take those groups and set them on a pathway to empowerment or the religious association? But I think finding the form of connectivity that works best in a particular context would be a very, very powerful force. And in Bangladesh, we have a microfinance group. But we have a very radical NGO sector that didn't focus on microfinance, but brought groups together around issues of right. That's really work. And building that connected consciousness, I think takes time, and it takes deliberative space. You need the space where people can deliberate and compare their experiences. So, in the end, I think for me, and obviously with the report of land and so on, if we're talking about patriarchy, start with and then lead that. If there is one transferable lesson that's not just Bangladesh, but India, is how to do that. I don't know if that's a bit anyway in terms of what.
Oh, a lot to think about. I don't have a question, but I kind of, this is the thought that comes to mind. So I guess it is a question, but you don't have to answer it. Which is, so we've talked a lot about the Bangladesh surprise, or in a very positive spin to it. But you mentioned it, you didn't say much about the threats from rising fundamentalism. So the question is this sustainable? Is this going to stay, or are we in for a different kind of shock? But I don't know if you deal with that in the book.
Yes, I do. And I see that so far. What we have to realize is that space for deliberative grassroots democracy has all these organizations that only to be got. And what has taken their place are religious and which offer the same kind of spirituality that those other countries. So my read, because these groups, these organizations are not talking about money. So it is about, and it's not taking on Islamic orthodoxy confrontation, but can we provide alternative models of justice? I think, without that, the studying classes have really become a phenomenon. And what they teach is not really, it's the opposite. It's think as whatever their version of spirituality is. I do have a paragraph at the end. Are not sustainable, and what we are seeing is rising inequality. So poverty is declining, but inequalities are continuing very high. Not as high as India, but we're seeing a kind of democratic liberation dividend. Yes, that phrase. And the democracy that we enjoyed in the 1990s, we're seeing that giving way to what appears to be one party. Re-elected. Not necessarily fair means. Now Bangladesh is at the bottom of Civitatis ranking of countries in terms of the openness. So you could say that the whole world of Bangladesh is now. We don't know.
All right, it's time. This was wonderful. I'm really glad you came by and also to do this, and we had a chance to talk. Thank you very much for people on Zoom. I'm sorry, I'm starting to like Zoom less and less, even though I realize it's a way of minimal investment. But thank you for staying with us. And thank you so much, Naila. And thank you, everyone.